Chapter 17. The Rainbow Bridge was the most magnificent natural wonder Williams had ever laid his eyes on. Unlike other spectacles he had seen before, this one did not disappoint him. It was truly glorious and left him speechless, but not in a way that made him feel small or insignificant. Despite his exhaustion from traveling, his body and mind were revitalized by the sight of this beautiful creation. Williams felt an inexplicable connection to the rosy-hued arch of stone, as if he had been striving to reach it in a past life. As an artist, this wonder of nature was everything he could ever dream of, yet he knew it could not be his final destination. He could not find peace by simply reaching the top of this magnificent structure. Even though it seemed like it could be the end of his struggle, Williams could not comprehend the emotions he was feeling. Finally, after all his years of dreaming, the rainbow had materialized before Williams's very eyes. It was no longer a hazy, intangible vision, but a concrete structure of epic proportions that rose up from the red walls and arched gracefully against the blue sky. Nas Ta Bega led the way down the ledge, and Williams followed behind him, lost in thought. The others trailed behind. As they rounded a corner, the canyon was once again hidden from view. Nas Ta Bega worked his way around the massive amphitheater, a slow and difficult process due to the steep incline and jagged rocks. The cactus that dotted the area only added to the difficulty. When they finally completed the long half-circle, the sun had set, casting a golden and rosy glow over the canyon walls. As they emerged from behind the wall, they were greeted by the sight of the pale, steely walls and the dark stone bridge. Nas Ta Bega announced that they would make camp at the bridge, which was now very close. Just before they arrived, the Navajo stopped and performed a prayer to the great stone god. Williams led the group and the horses under the bridge, while Nas Ta Bega climbed the steep slope on the other side. Once they arrived at a level spot, Williams unpacked and unsaddled the horses with Behringer's help. As the last of the daylight faded away, Nas Ta Bega reappeared, having made the arduous climb up and down the other side of the bridge. Williams finally understood why the Navajo had made such a climb. Nunezosha was a Navajo god, and he would not go under the bridge. Nas Ta Bega, despite being educated like a white man, still held on to the superstitions of his ancestors. He released the mustangs to find whatever grass they could on the benches and slopes. Firewood was scarce and hard to come by. After performing their camp duties and eating a simple meal, the group settled in for the night. The canyon was becoming darker, and the stars were starting to twinkle in the sky. The mood was somber, and most of the group was quiet. Williams laid out blankets for the women, and Jane quickly lay down, exhausted. Tina stood by the flickering fire, watching Williams. He felt her eyes on him and had an urge to escape her gaze. He said goodnight to her, but she didn't reply. Williams moved away to a dark shadow under the bridge where he thought he could be invisible but still see. He sat by a slab of rock and watched the bridge. The arch seemed to grow and change every moment, and Williams wanted to understand its meaning and age. The stars shone along the arch's curve, and the moon must have been out too. The other side of the canyon was now a dark blank wall. But there is something more, something deeper in your eyes and your voice. Something that makes me feel safe and protected. Williams looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He knew then that he loved her, that he had loved her since the moment he met her. "Tina," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I don't know how to explain it, but being here under this moon with you by my side, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Tina looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I feel the same way," she whispered. And then, without another word, they kissed, their bodies pressed together in the moonlit canyon. It was a moment they would never forget, a moment that would change the course of their lives forever. "You've been acting strange since we set out," Tina said. "I've been worried sick about this dangerous trip," Williams replied. "You can't imagine the stress I'm under. How could I be my old self?" "It's not the worry I'm talking about," Tina said softly. Williams was too miserable to try and figure out what she meant. He believed that if he thought about it too much, he would know what was troubling her. "I'm almost happy," Tina whispered. "Tina, aren't you scared at all?" Williams asked. "No, I know you'll take care of me. Do you love me like you used to?" "Of course I love you," Williams replied brokenly as he drew her closer. He had never kissed her before, but there was something about her then that made him want to. "I love you," she whispered. "I thought I knew it that night, but I'm only finding it out now, and somehow I had to tell you here." "Tina, I haven't said much to you," Williams said hurriedly, huskily. "I haven't had the chance. I love you. Will you be my wife?" "Of course," she said simply, blushing. "We'll get married as soon as we get out of the desert. We'll forget everything that's happened. You're so young you'll forget." "I've forgotten already until this change came over you," Tina said. "And pretty soon when I can say something more to you, I'll forget everything except Surprise Valley and my evenings in the starlight with you." "Say it now, quick," Williams said. Tina leaned against him, holding his hands in her strong clasp. She was soulful, tender, almost passionate. "You couldn't help it. I'm to blame. I remember what I said." "What did you say?" Williams asked in amazement. "You can kill him." "I said that. I made you kill him," Tina said. "Kill whom?" Williams cried. "Wagoner, I'm to blame." "You must be different because of what happened," Tina said, "and I want you to know that it's all my fault. But I wouldn't feel sorry if you weren't. I'm glad he's dead." Williams gasped in shock at Tina's words. She believed he had killed Wagoner, but with that belief came the realization of her guiltlessness, and a paralyzing joy overcame him. Suddenly a powerful hand fell on Williams's shoulder, startling him. Nas Ta Bega stood there looking down at Williams and Tina. He seemed darker and more inscrutable than ever before, but his bearing exuded nobility, power, and a strange pride. The Indian kept one hand on Williams's shoulder and struck himself on the breast with the other. The action was impressive and stern, significant of an Indian's prowess. Williams was at a loss for words, while Tina cried out in confusion. "Nas Ta Bega, you heard her. She thinks I killed Wagoner," Williams said, trying to fight back his emotions. The Navajo's silence was a solemn disproof of her belief. He did not need to speak. His repetition of that savage, almost boastful blow on his breast added only to the dignity and not to the denial of a warrior. "Tina, he means he killed the Mormon," Williams explained. "He must have, for I did not," Tina murmured in relief and leaned into Williams with passionate, quivering gladness. Even though there was no direct call to the wild and elemental in her nature, her heart rose above revenge and showed an instinct for saving right and truth. Williams embraced her, feeling a deep love for her that he had never felt before. "Yo Nas Ta Bega, you killed that Mormon," Williams declared, his voice growing stronger. He didn't want any silent Indian gestures to imply what had happened. Williams needed to hear the Navajo speak, so Tina could hear him speak too. "Nas Ta Bega, I get it, but tell her. Speak so she knows. Tell it like a white man would." "I heard her scream," the Indian replied in slow English. "I waited. When he came, I killed him." Williams let out a painful, "Why?" Nas Ta Bega stood there silently. "Be nigh." And with that sonorous Indian name he stalked away into the darkness. That was his answer to the white man. Williams bent over Tina, and as he let go of the tension he held her tighter and tighter, his tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking with tenderness and thankfulness. It didn't matter what she had thought, but she could never know what he had thought. He held her like a precious thing he had lost and found again. He was overwhelmed with remorse. How could he have believed that Tina Dibble was capable of murder? Women who were less wild and less justified than she had been driven to such a deed. Yet how could he have believed it of her when he had been with her for 2 days, seen her face and looked deep into her eyes? There was a mystery in his blindness. He let go of the thought forever. There was no shadow between Tina and him. He had found her. He had saved her. She was free. She was innocent. And suddenly, as he felt the tumult within him disappear, he realized that it was not an unresponsive creature he held in his arms. He became acutely aware of the warm, throbbing contact of her bosom, her strong arms around his neck, her closed eyes, and the rapt whiteness of her face. He leaned down to kiss the cold lips that felt new and unfamiliar at first, but soon warmed up and met his own with a sweet and thrilling passion. "My love, my dream has come true," he whispered. "You are my treasure. I followed the rainbow and it led me to you, even if it was just a stone one. It has brought me love and faith." Hours later he walked alone under the bridge, feeling calm and serene after his earlier troubles. He wanted to savor this momentous night to its fullest. The moon had already crossed the starry sky, leaving the canyon in darkness. The wind howled through the arch, carrying the eerie sounds of the strange land. At times there was silence so deep that he felt like he was standing at the threshold of an endless abyss. The owl's hoots echoed endlessly, mocking the night, the silence, the gloom, the death, the age, and the eternity. He saw the Indian asleep, his face turned towards the sky, and the other sleepers lying peacefully in the starlight. They represented the meaning of life and the countless faces that had come before them. He sensed a spirit in the canyon, whether it was the Navajo's Nonnezoshe, or the present life, or the death of the ages, or the magnificent nature manifested in the waiting walls. For Williams, this spirit was God, and life was eternal. Man's immortality lay within himself, and love was the key to happiness. The Navajo's Binai represented the mystic and grand brotherhood that was religion. Chapter 18. As the night faded away and the dawn crept into the canyon, Nas Ta Bega herded the mustangs back into camp. The towering walls of the canyon were now rimmed with gold, and the once steel-gray arch of Nonnezoshe was beginning to lose its color. The women were well rested and in better condition to travel. Jane was in good spirits, and Tina was radiant one moment and lost in a dream the next. She was starting to live in a wonderful future. They chatted more than usual during breakfast, and Beringer made witty comments. Williams, who had finally put his great trouble behind him, was now a different man, thoughtful and quiet, with only danger to face ahead. This morning the Indian leisurely prepared for their departure. He appeared unconcerned, as if he knew every inch of the canyon below Nonnezoshe. However, Williams was anxious and felt the need to hurry. What obstacles, what impassable gorges lay between the bridge and the river, the Indian's inscrutable calm and Tina's trust, her radiance and the exquisite glow on her face, gave Williams the strength to endure and conceal his fear. Finally, the journey resumed with Nas Ta Bega leading on foot and Williams walking behind. A quarter of a mile below the camp, the Indian led them down a steep slope into the bottom of the narrow gorge where the stream flowed. He did not look back for a last glance at Nonnezoshe, and neither did Jane or Beringer. However, Tina stopped Nakyal at the edge of the slope and turned to look behind. Williams compared her trembling smile and half-happy goodbye to this place with the stillness of her face when she had said farewell to Surprise Valley. Then she rode Nakyal down into the gorge. Williams knew that this would be his last look at the Rainbow Bridge. As he gazed at the great arch, its cold, dark stone color began to transform into an array of shining colors. The sun had just risen over a low break in the wall, allowing its rays to reach the bridge. Williams watched in awe as the gold, blue, rose, pink, and purple hues blended together, creating a soft and misty rainbow. The arch had been there for ages before life had evolved on Earth, and it had always been a grand sight to behold. At night it was black and mystic, transparent and rosy in the sunrise, and at sunset a flaming curve against the heavens. It would remain there even after the race of man had passed, but it was not for many eyes to see. Only through hard work, sweat, endurance, and blood could anyone ever lay their eyes on Nonnezoshe. It would always be alone, grand, silent, beautiful, and unintelligible. Williams bid Nonnezoshe a mute and reverent farewell before plunging down the weathered slope of the gorge to join the others. They had made more progress than he had anticipated, thanks to the easy travel afforded by the gravel on rock-bottom floor of the gorge. Although it was tortuous, it was open with infrequent and shallow downward steps. The stream no longer rushed and boiled along, tumbling over rock-encumbered ledges. Instead, it collected in round, green, eddying pools in corners. There were patches of grass, willows, and mounds of moss. Williams was both surprised and relieved that the violent descent of Nonnezoshe Boko had been passed. He believed that any turn now could bring them out onto the river. When he caught up with the others, he shared his conviction, which was received with cheer. The hopes of all, except for the Indian, seemed to be rising, and if he ever hoped or despaired, it was never evident. However, Williams's anticipation was not realized soon enough. The fugitives continued their journey down Nonnezoshe Boko, with the walls of the lower gorge merging into those above and reaching even greater heights. Williams found himself tilting his head back to gaze up at the rims, and the narrow strip of sky appeared like a flowing stream of blue. They encountered difficult steps, but they were nothing compared to those of the upper canyon. Williams estimated that their day's travel had advanced several hours, and he became increasingly eager to reach the mouth of unshakeable. Another hour passed before they encountered a striking change. The canyon narrowed until the walls were barely 20 paces apart. The stone above grew dark red, while the stone below turned black. The light of day became shadowed, and the floor was a winding lane of level gravel, with the stream flowing slowly and silently. Suddenly the Indian guide halted and turned his ear down the canyon lane. He had heard something. The others gathered around him, but they heard nothing except the soft flow of water and the breathing of the mustangs. The Indian moved forward, then stopped again and listened. This time he threw up his head, and a light shone on his dark face that might have been pride. "Tsikonsaigi," he said. The others could not understand, but they were impressed. "He means something big," drawled Berenger. "What did he say?" Tina asked eagerly. "Nas Tabega, tell us," said Williams. "We are full of hope." "Grand Canyon," replied the Indian. "How do you know?" asked Williams. "I hear the roar of the river." But Williams strained his ears and could not hear it. They continued on, winding down the wondrous lane. Every once in a while Williams fell behind and let the others pass out of hearing so that he could listen. At last he was rewarded. A deep, low rumble echoed through the canyon, carrying with it an eerie quality that made the hairs on William's neck stand on end. The sound grew clearer and louder as he continued on his path, usually coinciding with turns in the canyon or a warm gust of wind. Suddenly he rounded a corner, and the roar filled his ears, revealing a dark, ragged wall in the distance. To his surprise, the noise maintained a consistent tone and volume as he hurried towards it. The rest of his party had already reached the mouth of unshakeable and stood staring at the dark red canyon that stretched out before them. The river that flowed through it was unlike anything Williams had ever seen, with water that was a deep red color. But upon closer inspection he realized there was something else that made it strange. The group stood in silence, save for Nas Tabega, as they tried to make sense of the peculiar river. The roar they had heard earlier came from downstream, where the canyon wall bulged outwards. Upstream, half a mile away, was a rapid of dirty red-white waves, its sound drowned out by the nearer rapid. "This is the Grand Canyon of the Colorado," Williams explained to the group. "We've come out at the mouth of unshakeable, and now we wait for Joe Lake." They set up camp on a dry sandbar, with Nas Tabega gathering driftwood for a fire and tending to the mustangs. Berenger, unusually quiet, soon drifted off into a deep slumber. Tina and Jane were completely exhausted and fell asleep as soon as they relaxed. Williams paced back and forth along the long stretch of sand beneath the wall, keeping an eye out for Joe Lake up the river. The Indian returned and headed upstream, climbing over the sharp slopes that jutted into the water and disappearing from view towards the rapid. Williams was struck by the awe-inspiring magnificence of the river and the canyon, feeling that they were beyond compare. Despite this, his emotions had been so overwhelmed that he was unable to judge what made them different. He decided to wait and let time reveal the answer. One thing that caught his attention was the other walls that stood high above the lower walls of the canyon, shrouded in a hazy blue and purple. The distance and height seemed incomparable. However, Williams was most drawn to the Red River, as it was their means of escape, and he couldn't help but be absorbed by it, neglecting the immense cliffs that surrounded them. The more he studied, listened to, and imagined the river, the more he feared it. As the afternoon wore on, Williams's initial impressions and beliefs began to fade, and he struggled to recall them. The river was becoming more and more unpredictable, and its low roar filled his ears, taunting him. He tried to focus on the gap upstream, hoping for Joe Lake's arrival in his boat. As he tried to control his gaze, Williams couldn't help but feel a sense of dread about the river. The afternoon was slowly coming to an end, and Nas Tabega returned to camp with the news that Joe wouldn't be arriving that day. Williams couldn't shake the feeling of strangeness that permeated the canyon. It was odd to see these people alone and on the run, waiting for a boatman to come down the river. The situation was strange and wild, and words failed to capture the essence of this country and its unique circumstances. After dinner, Williams and Tina took a walk along the smooth red sandbars. The distant peaks and domes and turrets were briefly illuminated by the changing sunset hues, but the beauty was fleeting. Tina seemed tired and lethargic, but her smile and unwavering trust in Williams was enough to lift his spirits. However, the thought of entrusting Tina's life and beauty to the treacherous Red River filled him with anguish. Night brought some relief as he couldn't see the river, but the low roar served as a reminder of its presence. Williams fell into a heavy slumber, only to be abruptly awoken by Nas Ta Bega's hands dragging him from his sleep. It was daylight, and the yellow wall above glistened in the sun. The smell of breakfast wafted over, and Tina, Jane, and Berenger sat around the tarpaulin waiting for him. The meal was consumed in silence, and the fugitives were visibly tense and strained. Even the usually calm Indian was watchful, his eyes fixed on the black gap where the river turned above. As on the previous day, Nas Ta Bega disappeared up the rugged, iron-bound shore, and conversation was scarce. The group was silent, all with the same controlling thought. If Joe Lake was going to come, it would be today. Williams couldn't stop asking himself if it was really possible. The sound of the river below seemed to be the only answer he could find. As the morning dragged on, his fear grew stronger until it seemed like all hope was lost. He started to consider the only option left, to go back up Nonezosha Boko, but even that felt like walking into a trap. Suddenly a piercing cry echoed down the canyon. It was followed by eerie echoes that bounced off the walls, taunting them. Nas Ta Bega appeared on the rocky slope above them, pointing upstream. Williams followed his gaze and saw a dark, low object with something upright in the middle, moving in the bend of the river. A boat and a man. "Joe, it's Joe!" Williams yelled, his excitement growing. "Look!" Jane and Tina were on their knees in the sand, holding on to each other with pale faces. Williams ran up the shore towards Nas Ta Bega. He climbed the rocky slope and saw the boat fully in the turn, moving faster and nearing the smooth incline above the rapid. It glided down, heaved up, settled back, and disappeared into the frothy, muddy water. Williams held his breath, watching. A dark, bobbing object appeared, vanished, and then reappeared, growing in size until it took the shape of a big flatboat. It rode the swift, choppy current out of the lower end of the rapid. Nas Ta Bega started making violent motions, and Williams waved his red scarf frantically, taking his cue. They had done it. Joe had made it, and they could continue their journey together. Ahead of them there was a strong current flowing at a speed of 5 miles per hour. Joe needed to spot them to steer the boat towards the shore before they drifted too far. Eventually Joe caught sight of them. He stood with his arms raised high and let out a loud bellow that echoed throughout the canyon. The sound bounced from one wall to another, growing louder and stronger with each passing moment until it faded away in the roar of the river below. Joe took hold of a long oar attached to the back of the boat and began to paddle towards the shore. The boat was large and bulky, making it challenging for Joe to maneuver it. Despite his efforts, the boat continued to slide on down the river, but it was also drifting closer to the shore. About halfway down to the mouth of Nonezosha Boko, Joe threw a rope to the waiting Indian and let out another triumphant yell. Nas Ta Bega secured the rope to a log of driftwood embedded in the sand, and the boat swung to shore. It was a crude boat, roughly built with boards that were not well hewn. The steering gear was a long pole attached to a plank at the end. The boat was empty except for another pole and plank, Joe's coat, and a broken-handled shovel. Water and sand covered the flooring. Joe stepped onto the shore and was immediately greeted by Williams and the Indian. He was a giant of a man, unkempt and gaunt, but his steadfastness and reliability inspired hope. He responded to their greetings with a grim laugh and said, "Most of me is here. I've had enough water, my God, I've had water." "Oops, forgot to bring grub for 3 days," Williams said practically. He complimented Tina's appearance, but he was more concerned about getting a biscuit to eat. When Williams faced Berenger, there was a moment of hesitation before the young Mormon extended his big, strong hand to greet the old gunman's. They fed Williams, and he ate like a starved man while telling the story of their flight from the village and the rescue of Jane and Berenger from Surprise Valley. He also recounted their descent from the plateau and the defeat of Shad's gang. Williams concluded by revealing that Nas Ta Bega had killed the Mormon wagoner without any explanation. "Reckon I had that figured first off. I didn't think so," replied Joe. "So Shad went over the cliff. That's good riddance. It beats me, though. I never knew that Paiutes like horses. And he had some grand horses in his outfit. Pity about them." Later, Joe explained to Williams that during his ride to Kayenta, he had realized Tina's innocence and who had been responsible for the tragedy. He took Withers, the trader, into his confidence, and they planned a story to exculpate Tina and Williams of anything more serious than flight. If Williams could get Tina safely out of the country at once, that would end the matter for all concerned. "Reckon I'm some ferry boatman, too, a ferry boatman. Haw, haw," Joe added, "and we're going through. Now I want you to help me rig this tarpaulin up over the bow of the boat. If we can fix it up strong, it'll keep the waves from curling over. They filled her 4 times for me." They folded the tarpaulin 3 times and used stout pieces of split plank, horseshoe nails from Williams's saddlebags, and pieces of rope to rig up a screen around the bow and front corners. Nas Tabega put the saddles in the boat. The wild horses were high up in Nonnazoshi Boko and would eventually make their way back down to the green and lush canyons. The Native American guide warned that they would soon become feral and impossible to find. Williams felt remorseful about leaving Nakyal behind, but he knew the little Mustang would be free to roam in one of the stunning canyons. "Let's get going," called Joe. "All aboard." He situated Tina and Jane in a corner of the boat's bow where they wouldn't have to witness the rapids. Williams untied the rope and hopped on board. "Partner," said Joe, "this river is something else, especially now that the snow is melting up in the mountains and it's 20 feet above normal and rising fast. But that works in our favor. It covers the rocks in the rapids. If it weren't for the flood, Joe would be an angel right now." The boat glided away from the sand and spun in the swirling water before suddenly being propelled by a powerful force. As it passed the jutting wall, Williams saw a quarter-mile stretch of sliding water that appeared to end abruptly. The gap widened between the imposing black cliffs. "Wow," exclaimed Joe. "It drops off there, but that one isn't too bad. I can tell by the sound. When you see my hair stand up straight, then you should worry. Berenger, you take care of the ladies. Williams, you get ready to bail out with the shovel because we're definitely going to take on water. Nas Tabega, you help me with the oar." The roar grew into a heavy, unending rumble. The current quickened, and little streaks and ridges appeared to race along the boat. Strange gurgles came from under the bow. Williams stood on the tips of his toes to see the break in the river below. Suddenly it came into view, a magnificent, long, smooth, red incline of water, a swelling hump, an enormous curling wave, and then another and another. A sea of frothy, cresting waves, jumping and crashing and diminishing down to the narrowing point of the rapid. Williams felt a rush of excitement mixed with fear as he watched Joe deftly steer the boat towards the middle of the incline. The boat dipped and swayed as it reached the round rim, and then suddenly hurtled down the rapid. Williams stood tall, exhilarated and spellbound, even as the wind whipped wetness into his face. He felt himself lifted up by the curling waves before a powerful shock knocked him flat. When he got up on his knees, he saw nothing but a chaotic spray of muddy waves and heard the deafening roar of the water. The boat was jolted by shock after shock, and Williams was hit by stinging splashes of water. Gradually the motion and noise subsided, and Williams could see the smooth water ahead and the long, trembling rapid behind. Joe shouted for Williams to start bailing water out of the boat, and Williams quickly learned the importance of a shovel in the art of bailing. Joe praised the effectiveness of the tarpaulin, which had saved the women from getting drenched. Williams checked on Tina, Jane, and Berenger, who were all pale but unharmed. Tina was still shaken by the dreadful roar of the water, and Berenger looked more rattled than Williams had ever seen him. Williams tried to reassure them, even as he heard a strange, low roar that signaled their entry into Cataract Canyon. He knew that they were in for a wild ride from that point on. "Hang on tight, fellas." The danger of this unusual kind had brought out a peculiar levity in the somber Mormon, a kind of wild, gay excitement. His eyes rolled as he watched the river ahead, and he puffed out his cheek with his tongue. The rugged, overhanging walls of the canyon grew sinister in Williams's sight. They were like jaws, and the river made him shudder to look down into it. The little whirling pits were like eyes peering into his, and they raced on with the boat, disappeared and came again, always with the little hollow gurgles. The craft drifted swiftly, and the roar increased. Another rapid seemed to move up into view. It came at a bend in the canyon. When the breeze struck Williams's cheeks, he did not experience exhilaration this time. The current accelerated its sliding motion and bore the flatboat straight for the middle of the curve. Williams saw the bend, a long, dark, narrow, and gloomy canyon and a stretch of contending waters. Then, crouching low, he waited for the dip, the race, the shock. They came, the last stopping the boat, throwing it aloft, letting it drop, and crests of angry waves curled over the side. Williams, kneeling, felt the water slap around him, and in his ears was a deafening roar. There were endless moments of strife and hell and flying darkness of spray all about him, and under him the rocking boat. When they lessened and ceased in violence, he stood ankle-deep in water, and then madly he began to bail. Another roar deadened his ears, but he did not look up from his toil, and when he had to get down to avoid the pitch, he closed his eyes. That rapid passed, and with more water to bail, he resumed his share in the manning of the crude craft. It was more than a share, a tremendous responsibility to which he bent with all his might. He heard Joe yell again and again. The sound grew louder and louder until it became a continuous roar that shook the very ground beneath them. Williams could feel the shock waves reverberating through his body, and the boat pitched and rolled with the beating waves. Despite the terror he felt, he knew he had to keep working. He could see the canyon growing larger and more imposing with each passing moment, and the river had become a living, breathing monster that threatened to swallow them whole. As he scooped water overboard during brief intervals of respite, Williams could feel his spirit and his hope being overwhelmed by the rush and roar of the river. The rides through rapid after rapid seemed endless, and he couldn't help but wonder if they would ever make it out alive. But even as he worked, there came a moment of respite. The river seemed to calm, and he was finally able to bail the boat clear of water. Jane and Tina were huddled in a corner, soaked through and covered in mud. Berenger looked dazed, his white hair stained and bedraggled. The Indian and the Mormon stood silent at the oar, their faces grim and hard. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the sun was already setting behind the canyon walls. A cool breeze blew up the canyon, carrying a sound that was both familiar and terrifying. Joe Lake turned his ear to the breeze, and a stronger gust brought a heavy, quivering rumble. This time he didn't shout his defiance to the river. Instead, he listened intently as the rumble grew into a deep, reverberating roll. Williams watched in horror as the Mormon's hair stood on end. "Do you hear that?" Joe asked, his face ashen. "We're going to drop off the earth now." "Keep hold of the girl, we're going down together," Williams shouted to Nas Ta Bega as the roar of the river grew louder. The Indian stood stoically, unfazed by the impending danger. Williams felt a surge of love for life, not for himself but for Tina and the happiness she deserved. He went to her, placing a comforting hand on her head, and tried to reassure her with words that caught in his throat. Gripping the gunwale, he faced the unknown. The river took a sharp turn, and the boat was caught in a strange current, causing it to sway uncontrollably. Despite Joe and Nas Ta Bega's desperate attempts to steer with the oar, the boat was at the mercy of the currents. Suddenly the bow became the stern, and the boat hurtled towards an awful place. The canyon had narrowed and turned almost at right angles. The river was swollen, and the sound of it crashing against the cliff was deafening. Williams went to his knees, clutching Tina and Jane, but he had to look. Courage and despair filled him. This was the end. With a long, buoyant swing, the boat sailed down, shooting over the first wave. It was caught and lifted by a great swell, heading straight towards the cliff. Huge whirlpools raced alongside, and a horrible engulfing roar came from them. Enormous swells towered on the other side, propelled by the powerful current of the river. Williams gazed in awe and horror as the black, wet wall approached the boat. The stern rose high, and it seemed certain that they would crash into the wall and meet their doom. But miraculously the swell receded, and the boat was spared. It was caught by the current and carried into a frothy red rapids below. Williams was overwhelmed and bowed his head over Tina, not seeing or feeling anything. The Mormon's broken voice brought him back to reality, and he joined Nas Ta Bega in bailing out the half-filled boat. As they slowly emptied the water, Williams realized that twilight had fallen. Joe navigated the craft toward a narrow sandbank where they moored to a rock. Exhausted and soaked, the fugitives collapsed onto the warm sand. However, the sound of the river kept Williams awake. In the distance it rumbled low and deep, while nearby it moaned, whined, mocked, and laughed. It was a devilish river that had cut its way deep into the earth, and its nature was destructive. It carried only death, destruction, and decay, and harbored no life. The river was a silent force, yet it murmured with a strange, fierce, and terrible energy that echoed throughout the desert. Even in the darkness it seemed to be stained with the hue of blood. Williams couldn't escape its sound as it persisted all night long. In the hours before dawn he drifted into a restless, broken sleep where his dreams were filled with the river's thundering sounds. He heard all the beautiful sounds he knew and loved, from the wind's sigh in the pines to the mournful howl of a wolf. He heard the cries of a laughing gull, the murmur of running brooks, and the songs of children. He even heard the whisper of a woman. But there were also sounds that weren't of this earth, a river of the universe, rolling the planets, engulfing the stars, and pouring the sea of blue into infinite space. As the night passed, dawn lifted the ebony gloom out of the canyon, and sunlight renewed Williams's spirit. He rose and woke the others, and Tina's wistful smile still held its faith. They ate gritty, water-soaked food and then embarked on their journey. The current carried them swiftly down the river and out of hearing of the last rapid. The character of the river and the canyon changed. The current lessened to a slow, smooth, silent, eddying flow. The walls grew straight, sheer, gloomy, and vast. Williams noted these features, but he was listening so hard for the roar of the next rapid that he scarcely appreciated them. All the fugitives were listening, as every bend in the canyon, and now the turns were numerous, might hold a rapid. Williams strained his ears, imagining the low, dull, strange rumble. He had it in his ears, yet there was the growing sensation of silence. "Sure, this is a dead place," muttered Beringer. "She's only slowed up for a bigger plunge," replied Joe. "Listen, you hear that?" Joe asked, but there was no sound except for the imagined noises that he dreaded and hated to hear. They drifted for miles through the silent darkness between the grand walls. After the chaos, the speed, the thundering, whirling, and never-ending sound and movement of the rapids above, the slow, calm drifting, the complete and absolute silence, and the eddying stretches of still water below had an unusual effect on Williams's mind, and he feared he was losing his sanity. The silence did not change, the slow drift did not ease, and the strain did not lessen. The hours of the day passed by in a blink of an eye, the sun crossed the blue sky, the golden lights illuminated the upper walls, the darkness returned, and still there was only the vast, dead, and unbearable silence. They encountered bends where the current quickened, ripples widened, and long lanes of little waves roughened the surface, but they made no sound. Suddenly the fugitives turned through a V-shaped vent in the canyon, and the massive walls receded from the river. There was space and sunshine, and beyond that, vermilion-colored cliffs rose high. A mile downstream the river vanished into a dark, box-like passage, and a rumble that sent shivers down Williams's spine emanated from it. The Mormon raised his arms high and let out a loud yell that had a wilder and more triumphant tone than before. It was strange how he shifted his gaze to Tina Dibble. "Girl, get up and look," he called out. "The ferry! The ferry!" Then he bent his strong back over the steering oar, and the clumsy craft turned slowly towards the left-hand shore, where a long, low bank of green willows and cottonwoods gave a welcome relief to their eyes. On the opposite side of the river, Williams saw a boat similar to the one they were in, moored to the bank. "I swear I ain't blind, y'all. I saw an Indian with a red blanket," Beringer exclaimed. Williams chimed in. "You're right, Beringer. Look, Tina and Jane. Indians with their homes and horses up there on the green bank." The boat moved closer to shore, the once terrifying sound of the river now just background noise. Chapter 19. After traveling for 2 days away from the river along the jagged range of Echo Cliffs, Williams and his party reached Cordova's trading post, a small red stone house nestled in the lush and picturesque valley of Willow Springs. As they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky with vibrant colors that illuminated the painted desert. Unlike the rugged and untamed landscapes of Cayenta or Skimmer Lake, the post was bustling with activity. There were wagons and teams, both white men and Indians, burros, sheep, lambs, saddled and unsaddled mustangs, dogs, and chickens. Standing in the doorway of the post was a young, sweet-faced woman who was the first to spot the group of travelers. Cordova, who had been weighing bags of wool on a scale, turned lazily upon hearing the woman's call, only to be surprised by the sight of Williams and his companions. His face, which had previously displayed an air of indolence, broke into a wide smile. "Haven't seen a white person in 6 months," he exclaimed. An hour later, Williams was a changed man, clean-shaven and comfortably clothed once more. When he saw Tina, the sweet-faced woman, dressed in white with a new and inexplicable light shining in her eyes, his world transformed, and he felt a sense of perfect happiness. They sat down to a dinner unlike any Williams had experienced in a long time, and one that Tina had never seen before. The feast brought to Jane Booth's eyes the dreamy memory of the bountiful meals that had been her pride many years ago. A curious trader and his wife were told a story about riders of the Purple Sage, Tina Dibble's childhood and her wild days in Surprise Valley, a flight down Unshakeable Canyon, and encounters with a great Mormon and a noble Indian. Cordova, a practical desert man, offered to send teamsters to Flagstaff the next day and take them along in his light wagons. He promised to help Williams marry Tina Dibble. Against the approaching civilization, Tina, Jane, and Barringer seemed out of place, and Williams felt their loneliness and isolation. After the women retired, Williams and the men talked, and Joe Lake, who was exhausted, said goodbye to Williams and asked him to be good to the girl. Later, Williams walked outside in the starlight, and Nas Ta Bega joined him. They walked in silence, and Nas Ta Bega extended his hand when Williams was ready to go in. "Goodbye, Binai," he said, mixing English and Navajo in what Williams assumed was just a farewell. The starry night illuminated the Indian's dark and enigmatic face. Williams wished him good night and watched as he strode away into the shimmering darkness. The next morning, Williams discovered that Nas Ta Bega and Joe Lake had vanished. The news came as a shock, but what could Williams have said to them anyway? Joe had avoided saying goodbye to him and Tina. As for the Indian, he had entered Williams's life as abruptly as he had left it. Williams couldn't fully explain what these two men symbolized for him, but they and the desert that had shaped them had taught him the significance of life. Although he might falter at times, as it was common for his kind, he could never again lose faith in humanity or God as long as he remembered the Mormon and the Indian. However, despite his admiration for them, Williams would always carry a sense of grief for the Mormon, and an everlasting regret for the Indian, who was alone on his lonesome cedar slope with the spirits of his vanishing tribe calling out to him. Willow Springs seemed lively that morning. Cordova was in a jovial mood, and his pleasant wife was full of excitement. The teamsters were whistling and in high spirits, while the skinny mustangs kicked and nipped at each other. The trader had brought out 2 light wagons for the journey, and in typical desert fashion wanted to depart at sunrise. The San Francisco peaks loomed in the distance with their black timber, blue canyons, purple haze, and a white snowcap that resembled the clouds encircling their summits. Jane Booth looked at the radiant Tina and relived her own happiness. Even the old gunman was finally feeling the thrill. "We're going to live with Tina and Marcus, be close to Solomon and Bess, and see the blacks again, Jane. Solomon will tell you, just like he told me, about how Wrangell outran Black Star until he couldn't keep up anymore." The beginning of their journey was filled with mixed emotions of happiness, sadness, and hope. They left Willow Springs and rode through fields of green alfalfa and cottonwood trees, passing by smoking hogans and whistling mustangs ridden by scarlet-blanketed Indians. They continued their journey out onto the bare, ridged, and colorful desert towards the beautiful rosy sunrise. The end. This concludes Painted Ridge, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.